What is going on, guys, and welcome back to the channel. We are going to be back on the GTO today. We are finally going to be getting rid of that fuel pressure gauge that you see right here behind me on the windshield. We finally picked ourselves up a nice AEM pressure gauge. As some of you guys may know, the AEM gauges only come in oil pressure, so we had to go ahead and pick ourselves up the accessory kit. So we're going to have to change the faceplate on that, then get it wired in and plumbed into the system. As always, guys, don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell. That way you get notified anytime we put out a video with the GTO, the Duramax, or the Hellcat. Let's go ahead and get through the intro and then get to work. Alright guys, so now that we are through the intro, let's go ahead and take a look at what we've got going on here. So like I mentioned, you can see the fuel pressure gauge that we've got taped to the window there. We put that there back when we were tuning. It's just my Mako fuel pressure tester, and I just taped it up there so that when we were driving the car on the street, starting to get the tune dialed in, that we knew our fuel system was working. We did a couple videos on the fuel system of this car. I made a custom basket for it in the stock tank, did a full return style fuel system using pump. We can add another pump to it when the time comes, because we are running the Pro Charger at right around 19 pounds of boost, so it's pretty demanding, but we are on pump gas still, running methanol, so it's not as demanding as E85 would be, but that's the plan for the car. But we are going to be switching over to flex fuel here in the near future, so we wanted to get the fuel pressure gauge set up so that we can keep an eye on it and always know if pressure starts to drop. So like I said, we're going to be getting rid of that gauge up there. We will be putting our gauge back on the regulator like it belongs. Then we're going to be teeing into our system so that we can run our new AEM fuel pressure gauge. As you guys can see, we've got two AEM gauges up there now, air fuel ratio and oil pressure, which we did videos on. And then to the left, we've got a cheaper glow shift boost gauge. So we're going to be moving that boost gauge that you see right there on the left. We will put our new AEM gauge there so that all the AEM gauges are together, and we will be putting our boost gauge over here in the corner, which I will show you guys what we're going to use to do that. We will be doing a triple pod at some point in time, but for now we're not going to bother with that. We're just going to get it functional so that we can get this car out and start having some fun with it. So let's take a look at what we got to make all this happen. So we picked up the AEM pressure gauge here. This one is oil pressure because I believe that's the only way you can get them. Part number is right there, which, as always, I will link all of this stuff in the description below. Then you also have to get this accessory kit, which comes with the fuel pressure face and the bezel here. I also picked up a harness extension for the oil or fuel pressure, since they are the same. You can use this for either gauge, and I also believe GM style sensors as well. It's just a nice little extension so we don't have to cut up the AEM harness. Also picked ourselves up a little T for the port for the pressure sensor, so we can just put this, it's a -8 AN fitting, so we can put it right in line wherever we decide and put our sensor right into this. Then this is what we're going to be using to mount the boost gauge for now. It is not ideal, but it's going to get the job done. I don't want to get the triple pod gauge right now. They're super expensive for the GTOs, just like everything else. So we're going to be using this. I'll probably stick it to the windshield for the time being, and I think it's going to do the job just fine. We were going to go ahead and put the new AEM gauge in that pod, but I think it would look funny having two AEM gauges over there with the boost gauge and then another AEM on its own over in the corner. So we're going to keep all the AEMs together and put the boost gauge off on its own. Like I had mentioned, we will be getting a pod for this thing so that we can run 3 gauges on the pillar, and then maybe get one for around the dash bezel so that it looks a little bit cleaner. But for now, the way that we have made the other pods work, and we're going to make this pod work, I think it's going to be perfectly functional for the time being. So let's go ahead and get the gauge apart, start taking the face out of it, and get the fuel pressure face back in it so that we can start wiring and plumbing this thing into the car. Alright guys, so as you can see, we've got the gauge here, like I had mentioned, with the oil pressure face on it. So the first thing that we're going to do is carefully, because we don't want to scratch anything up here, but you can see we've got 3 small screws on the back side of it. So you're going to need a small Phillips screwdriver, I believe it's a number 1, and we're going to have to go ahead and pop these 3 screws out. So let's go ahead and do that. These screws should be about ready to come out. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip mine on its back like so. And I'm just going to carefully take this bezel off. You want to pay attention to which way this comes apart. So you can see we've got our buttons right there. Okay, so once you get it down to here, we can start getting ready to put this thing back together. So in my case, on the back of my old faceplate here, you'll see this white thing. I believe it's called the diffuser. Make sure you go ahead and snag that. Mine was stuck to the back, so we're going to go ahead and grab that. I'm going to go ahead and put it back on here, just so we don't forget. Then we can take our new face that we're going to be using. I'm putting the fuel PSI facing out, so we're going to go ahead and put that one on. Then we can take our lens and put that back in. Make sure you put all this stuff back together the way you took it out. Now we can take our bezel and line up the screws and get this put back in place. You don't want to tighten these things down too much. And there you have it, guys. It's back together. We've got our fuel pressure PSI facing out. This is pretty much ready to install. So now we can head on over to the car and start taking care of the wiring and the plumbing, and then figure out how we want to mount it. So let's head over to the car. So we're gonna go ahead and start taking the side of the dash apart here, get that panel off, and start running our wiring for both gauges so that we can get this part done. The wiring is my least favorite part of pretty much any project, which you guys might already know. So I try to tackle that first, and then we can get to the easy part like plumbing it and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and get this part done so we can move on to something else. So as you guys can see, we got the new gauge in there. I think it looks pretty sweet being all AEM now. I think once we get power ran to it and get it hooked up, I think it's going to look much better and more uniform there with them all being AEM and functioning the same. So I think that's going to be pretty cool. We do still have to get some of the wiring done and get that sensor plumbed like I had mentioned before, but it's getting to be about midnight here, so I'm going to go ahead and call it quits for tonight, and we will jump back on it tomorrow afternoon and get this thing wrapped up. Alright guys, so it is the next day and we are back down here in the garage working on the GTO. As you can see, we've got the Hellcat up on stands behind me. We were working on that a little bit this afternoon, but I wanted to get in here and try to wrap this video up, so I wanted to work on getting this gauge install done. We did go ahead and get the wiring finished up. Like I had mentioned before, it's super simple and I went over it in more detail in the previous oil pressure gauge install video. The only 2 wires that you're going to be using out of the harness, besides the harness that goes to the sensor itself, in the other harness you're going to have multiple wires. The only 2 you're going to use is the black and the red. The red's going to be a 12 volt switched source, so something that comes on with the key preferably, and then black is obviously ground. So we went ahead and did that, got that wrapped up, came out pretty good. I'll give you guys a peek at it real quick. We got the boost gauge moved as well. You can see the boost gauge over there on the left. Doesn't look too bad, still not ideal. It would be nice to do a nice pillar gauge pod when we get a minute. But for now, I think it looks pretty sweet. We're gonna stick with it. Got all the wiring tucked up underneath the dash. So that came out pretty good. Now it is time to move on to the plumbing side of this. Like I mentioned before, I did go ahead and get a 24-inch extension harness because I don't think we're gonna be able to reach where I wanna put the sensor. So we're gonna have to use that. But we will get the sensor and the adapters that we're going to use, and I will show you guys where we're going to plumb this in. Alright guys, so the first thing that we're going to do is go ahead and get this Aeromotive fuel pressure gauge back onto the regulator. If you guys seen the multiple videos we did when we built this whole fuel system for this car, I got this gauge when I got the regulator, and we had it on there briefly before we took it off to put this port so we could run that other gauge on the windshield so that I could see the pressures while we were driving the car. But now that we're going to be having that gauge in the car, the AEM gauge, we won't need this anymore, so I'm going to put the Aeromotive gauge back on here. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab a little can. This is just an old filter I had cut at one time to check, and I'm just going to set that right there for this second. Hold this and break this loose. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and wipe that out and just make sure those threads are clean. Now I'm going to take some Permatex thread sealant right here and put that on the threads of this pressure gauge that we're going to be using, just to make sure we don't have any leaks. Now we can just go ahead and start threading this on. Just going to go barely by hand, and then we'll grab a wrench. I might have to go get a normal wrench. Don't forget to keep in mind where the gauge face is so that you can stop it where you want it. I think we're going to go somewhere right around there. That looks pretty straight to me. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that just as it is, just like that. Now we can grab what we need and start getting ready to plumb this sensor in. Alright guys, so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to break this line loose. I'm going to drain the fuel into that can we were using and just let that drain a minute. We're going to be using a -8 AN with a 1/8 inch NPT female thread port in it so that we can thread the AEM sensor into it and put this right in place right here. So we'll just disconnect this line, this will go in, and then that will hook back up. We use -8 feed lines and lines coming out of the rails to the regulator before it goes to a -6 return, which once again you guys can see the video on building this whole fuel system, but that's why we went with this fitting. It's just going to make life much easier. Pop this out, pop this in, put the sensor on, and we should be good to go. So let's get that draining. I'm going to take a little bit more of that thread sealant that we just used and put it on the threads for this sensor. Should be good to go. Just going to start getting this threaded into this right here. You can use thread sealant on the NPT threads for the sensor, but do not use any thread sealant on the AN fittings. Now we can just go ahead and get this guy started. Now this is where that harness extension is going to come into play. We're going to use that to plug into this sensor. Alright, so we went ahead and got our harness extension plugged in. Now we're going to go ahead and tighten up this first fitting. Now what I'm going to do is just make sure that we got that sensor nice and tight in there. Remember that sensor is only, I believe, brass going into an aluminum AN fitting and adapter here. So we're going to leave that. Now we can go ahead and tighten up this line. Alright guys, that should be good to go. Alright guys, let's go ahead and cycle the key and make sure that all the gauges still come on like they should and that we get pressure on the fuel pressure gauge. Saying 60 pounds. Just where we had it set. Boost gauge lit up. That seems to be working as well. Now we've got all of our gauges hooked up and working. Fuel pressure seemed to, the pump kicked off, so the pressure started to drop. I'm going to go ahead and kill the key. Everything shuts off like it should. I'm going to give it a second on these GTOs, or at least the way we have it set up. When this check engine light goes out, I can cycle the key and the pump will cycle again. Check engine light's out. Let's do it again. 60 pounds. Let's go out there and check for leaks. I don't see or feel any leaks. That's a good sign, guys. This gauge is also reading. So we should be pretty much good to go. That pretty much wraps up the AEM fuel pressure gauge install. I wanted to show you guys how to change that faceplate and how I plumb them in, especially since I've done so many videos on building the whole fuel system for this car. As always, guys, I appreciate you for checking out the channel. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell. That way you get notified anytime we put out a video with the GTO, the Duramax, or the Hellcat, and we will catch you on the next one.